It's sometimes hard to believe how long I've been making videos on this channel. I've mentioned before that now I'm not satisfied with how my earlier videos turned out. After all, I was learning how to make videos as I went along, with little previous experience. I also didn't bother to avoid copyright claims then because I wasn't monetized. So I decided to redo some of my older short documentary videos from scratch, revise and expand the scripts, and upload them as one long video. So, without further ado, here they are. Many of the trends or random things that happened in 1920s society can be just plain funny to us now in their absurdity. And the Straw Hat Riot of 1922 is one of those things. Around the turn of the century, men wore various kinds of headwear, like newsboy caps, bowlers, or straw hats. Not the Tom Sawyer kind of straw hat, but this kind, which was usually called a boater. It was comfortable to wear in the summer when engaging in leisure activities. It gradually became socially unacceptable for men to wear straw hats after the end of summer. It was considered lame and scandalously unfashionable. And there existed an unofficial social rule that men shouldn't wear straw hats after September 15th. This date seems to have been chosen arbitrarily, but nonetheless, it was generally accepted. This rule concerning straw hats was especially common in cities, and New York took it pretty seriously. But many men rebelled against this social norm, or just ignored it. However, others in the community, teenage boys and young men, took to swiping these hats off of unsuspecting men in the streets after the end of summer, which in this case was unofficially September 15th. This wasn't just to steal them or anything. It was really just to cause trouble. Sometimes they would even stomp on the hat when it fell to the ground, just for good measure. But in 1922, straw hat wearing men had had enough. Roving gangs of boys had been harassing them especially badly all around New York City in the days leading up to September 15th. The first incident began 2 days before the date. On the 13th, a group of these hat-hunting hoodlums messed with the wrong guys. They picked a fight with dock workers, armed with sticks fashioned with hooks or nails on the end, perfect for hat snatching. But the dock workers fought back, drawing the fight into the streets. Despite this early defeat, the onslaught of hats continued. The worst of it came on the night of the 15th. In some cases, men were surrounded by boys who summarily destroyed their headwear in front of them. According to some reports, there was a group of 1,000 boys engaging in this reckless practice during the night, and the police were called in to assist. Hat stores stayed open later than usual to cater to the men whose hats had been destroyed by selling them soft hats, which were acceptable for the season. Some streets were reportedly littered with the lifeless corpses of straw hats. And there were also reports of straw hat bonfires. One man on the street account witnessed an attack. This evening at Canal and Mott Streets, I saw a gang of troublesome fellows destroying the straw hats of pedestrians. They had a string of them called scalps hanging from a lamppost when 2 men also wearing straw hats came along. Immediately, the gang set upon them. But these men didn't run as the others had done. Instead, they each grabbed one of the young men and fought with the others until at the cry, "They're bulls!" all but the 2 in the grasp of the detectives ran. They were taken to the station house. Policemen were not excluded from the destruction. At least 3 off-duty officers had their hats snatched and crushed. Before, they hadn't been too concerned with the boys' activities, but when their hats were added to the list of victims, the heat was on. Here's an excerpt from a newspaper article printed the following day. Patrolman King and Lamore came in hatless and indignant with 7 boys, all less than 15 years old, who, they said, were members of a gang that had knocked off their hats and trampled them. Lieutenant Lenehan invited the boys' fathers to come to the station and spank them, and the invitation was cordially accepted. In other police stations, it wasn't an invitation. Some parents were ordered by the officer in charge to spank their sons as official punishment. Men in their 20s who were caught were given small fines of $5 in night court. However, a local magistrate whose name was, and I'm not joking, Peter A. Hadding, warned that others brought in could go to prison. In total, the Straw Hat Riot lasted about 8 days, but the horror finally stopped. The unfashionable men had won, and continued to wear whatever they pleased on their heads as long as they could handle the social disapproval. And these men had another unexpected victory the following year. When Calvin Coolidge became president after the death of Warren G. Harding, he proudly wore his straw hat outside of the summer months in public. And that was the story of the Straw Hat Riot of 1922. And let it be an inspiration to any man whose out-of-season fashion gives him ridicule, because it's one small step from ridicule to indiscriminate hat smashing. Instead, we should learn from those brave men and their sacrifices, and let us never allow something like this to happen again. I'm gonna tell you about a conspiracy, but before you think this is some kind of crackpot idea, I'll tell you now that this one actually turned out to be true. This is the story of the Phoebus Cartel and the Great Lightbulb Conspiracy. In 1879, Thomas Edison and Joseph Swan both independently introduced the first carbon filament light bulb. Compared with earlier platinum filament light bulbs, these new ones were much more affordable, and the future looked bright, literally. Well, we all know that Edison's light bulb came out on top. This early light bulb could only last about 14.5 hours. Then Edison used bamboo, which increased the bulb's lifespan to 1,200 hours, though it still wasn't too bright. In 1911, the carbon filament light bulb was replaced by a metal filament light bulb containing tungsten, made by Edison's company General Electric. The next step was making these new light bulbs last longer. This had the potential of rapidly increasing productivity around the world. As we've already seen, the use of bamboo helped this, but more innovation was to come. By 1924, the average light bulb could last approximately 2,500 hours. Progress was so rapid that it seemed like we would eventually get a light bulb that would last virtually forever. In fact, to demonstrate the longevity of these older light bulbs, this is the Centennial Light, so named because it has been burning more or less continuously since 1901, over 120 years. But even now, incandescent light bulbs only last about the same amount of time as they did nearly 100 years ago. Of course, there are different bulbs that do last much longer, like fluorescent and LED lights, but for this video, let's focus on the classic incandescent. Okay, so we've already established that the average incandescent light bulb in about 1924 lasted about 2,500 hours. But then in 1926, it went down to 1,800 hours. And by about 1933, it was down to about 1,200 hours. It seemed like technology had somehow regressed, even during the better years of the 1920s. So, what happened? Well, first, let's think about simple business. If light bulbs in the 1920s lasted thousands and thousands of hours, then people wouldn't buy as many. And if prices were hiked massively to make up for that, there would be a lot of complaints. A sneaky and discreet solution would be to purposely reduce the lifespan of light bulbs. This is a practice known as planned obsolescence. And let's keep in mind that all the companies making light bulbs were not doing it for the betterment of mankind. They were doing it for the money. Some of the biggest light bulb manufacturers from around the world got together and made a plan to purposely reduce the lifespan of their products. After all, such a scheme wouldn't work unless the biggest players in the industry conspired together. The leading men from these companies secretly met in Geneva on December 23, 1924. This coalition was initially pushed by the German company Osram, and it quickly gained traction. This group of companies was called the Phoebus Cartel. Included in the Phoebus Cartel were the major light bulb manufacturers from the United States, Germany, the Netherlands, France, Hungary, the United Kingdom, China, Japan, Brazil, and Mexico. And they saw huge profits after putting this plan into action starting in 1925. The Phoebus Cartel overall saw profits increase by 25% only a couple of years after the conspiracy began. It was a virtual monopoly on light bulbs, though since these companies were separate, it was more like an oligopoly. All of this was very illegal, so the conspiracy was kept under wraps. This secret was especially confidential because it also involved price fixing. Since all the companies were enjoying high profits, it would have been natural to reduce prices, but in this case, prices stayed relatively the same. Just making a bad quality product would have been a sloppy solution, so the Phoebus Cartel companies had to make the bulbs fail precisely, something which took about as much effort as to increase their lifespan. There were multiple ways to do this, like for example, changing the voltage or changing the current. Inevitably, some members of the cartel tried to secretly get one up on the others by making longer-lasting bulbs, but no one really broke through without being caught by the others who were in on the whole thing. And there were constant disputes between members. There were just too many interests at stake in a flourishing industry. There was also the problem of growing competition. Smaller companies who were not members of the cartel were able to produce competing bulbs. While they weren't able to make significantly longer-lasting light bulbs since they didn't have access to the best electrical engineers like the big companies did, they were able to sell them more cheaply. As with pretty much every other industry, the Great Depression further hurt profits. By the outbreak of World War II, the cartel had disbanded and all but disappeared. But that's not to say that the idea of planned obsolescence disappeared. This practice was unacceptable during World War II, when resources needed to be conserved and rationed, but it sprouted up again in the following decades, and can even be found today, much to the chagrin of informed consumers. I think this story is a good example of assuming too much about old technology. We often assume that technology like these vintage light bulbs was just bad because they were in a lower stage of development. And in most cases, that would be true to some extent. But the tale of the Phoebus Cartel shows that sometimes progress is artificially slowed, and isn't always due to a lack of ability. In June 1921, a movie was released that is now lost. But this movie was a bit more controversial than most other lost films. Heedless Moths told the story of model Audrey Munson's life, with her making an appearance in it. Unless you've watched my original video about this, you probably don't know her, but she was considered the modern Venus de Milo of her time, posing as a model, often nude, countless times for artists, who featured her figure on statues, sculptures, and architectural details. Yet, despite experiencing rare international fame in the Gilded Age, her name doesn't really register with most people now. This is the story of Audrey Munson and her very, very long fall from the top. Munson became an international beauty sensation after she had posed for perhaps as many as 36 works of art to be shown at the Panama Pacific International Exposition in 1915, and she became associated with that specific event. A few years later, in 1919, she had been involved in a scandal when she had been linked to an affair with a married doctor who had murdered his wife. The doctor, who was her landlord, had fallen in love with Audrey, but it doesn't seem that she reciprocated. His wife knew of his infatuation, and before she was murdered, had asked Audrey to leave the boarding house. But that didn't prevent suspicions that she was his mistress, though there was no real proof that this was true, and her reputation was tarnished by the incident. Earlier that same year, she wrote to the State Department, showing a paranoia of a conspiracy against her by the German government and some German Americans. Also by this time, she was seeking to restart her career and to be in the spotlight once again. She had to live with her mother, with little money between them. The scandal surrounding the doctor had been so damaging, in fact, that she was apparently seeking out normal jobs as a clerk or a waitress. At least that's what the newspapers reported. After signaling that she wanted a second chance, she agreed to a movie deal, and Heedless Moths was set for release in early June 1921. It got a lot of hype thanks to a 6-month promotional campaign in the Hearst Media Network, which ran double-page articles supposedly, but not actually, written by Munson herself. The controversy of the movie was due to Munson posing nude in it. While another actress, Jane Thomas, played Munson for all the acting parts, Munson herself performed the nude scenes. This wasn't actually the first time she had done this, however. She had appeared nude multiple times before in independent films, each time stirring up some controversy. A censorship board had been established in Hollywood back in 1909, and her previous films had slipped by, claiming that the nudity was artistic, not sexual, though some scenes were recommended to be edited down to reduce the screen time for the nudity. But because of the controversial nature of the films, they were almost guaranteed to not be too successful, because some exhibitors would inevitably refuse to show it on the grounds that it might damage their reputation and business. While movies like Flaming Youth showed some scandalous behavior, it didn't show actual nudity. It only teased some mildly sexual things. Many average people would have considered any kind of nudity sexual, and a step too far for movies. Additionally, it seems that these movies weren't especially good either. They weren't backed by a big studio, and mostly relied on their artistic novelty. Though some people were refreshed by having something so artistic finally put on the screen. Of Heedless Moths, Munson said, "I bared my body and gave to the world a masterpiece. In giving Heedless Moths to the screen, I have bared my heart and soul." But not many agreed that it was a masterpiece. It received pretty negative reviews for a lack of an engaging story, plus the offense caused to some people. The film premiered at the Greenwich Village Theatre on June 3, 1921. Greenwich Village already had a reputation for being a bohemian area that was more accepting of edgier things that were done in the name of art. The movie, in addition to its most obvious appeal, also sometimes used other gimmicks to give its exhibition a boost in New York City. This included utilizing small screens off-center of the stage, the film screen being cut out to reveal the actual cast in person behind it, and concluding with an appearance of Munson herself at the end of the film. These gimmicks received mixed reviews from critics, one writing in the New York Times that, "The most interesting thing about the performance, in fact, is watching for the next stunt of presentation." Another critic in the Film Daily wrote, "The continuity of the film is only fair, but might seem better if the picture were run straight away and not broken for stage effects as it is in its New York presentation." The film, while sparking a lot of attention in the press for its controversial nature, was ultimately a flop, and Munson's career had already been on the wane. She would soon be 30, deemed too old for a model prized for her natural beauty. Around the same time, another new film starring her was making the rounds, though this turned out to be just a repackaged and re-edited version of a previous film from 5 years ago. In the September 1921 issue of Photoplay magazine, the most popular movie magazine of the time, published an editorial that read as follows: "Heedless Moths, despite whatever claim it may make as a story or dramatic photoplay, is nothing but a bold bid to indecency. Produced by Perry Photoplays, it is the characteristic exhibition of certain new producers who bring nothing into the field but an insincere vehicle to make a little tainted money. Its star is Audrey Munson, who may or may not be remembered in an undraped celluloid demonstration satirically called Purity. Heedless Moths had to have a story, and this one is laid in Greenwich Village, that overrated and so-called artistic quarter of New York City. It is not an interesting story. It is a tiresome play. And let us hasten to add, in order that no craven pulse may quicken with anticipation, it does not even purvey the prurient thrill which is its thinly veiled pretense. No one knew better than its producers that downright uncleanliness could not be shown at all. So that all we have left is mock sentimentality, lachrymose titling, a considerable extent of unnecessary and unstimulating epidermis, and boredom. Don't patronize it, for it is not worth your attention from any angle. If you do patronize it, you are adding fuel to the intolerant flame of censorship." While that editorial mentions that the movie didn't really deliver on the expectation of nudity, there is a movie still supposedly from Heedless Moths that shows Munson completely naked, so there's some conflicting information about that. As scathing as Photoplay's comments were, there was some truth to them. Without the expectation of nudity as its novelty, not many people would have cared about Heedless Moths. Audrey Munson might have been famous years before, but her career was on the decline, and there wasn't much demand for her life story. And its comment about censorship at the end proved very telling. Shortly afterward, a big event happened in Hollywood, the Fatty Arbuckle murder scandal. This caused the movie industry to try and clean up its image, especially since this was just one of quite a few scandals from the previous couple of years. This would be the final nail in the coffin for Heedless Moths. In Greenwich Village, a movie poster depicting a reproduction of a nude statue Munson had posed for was ordered to be taken down by a judge around the time of Heedless Moths' release. It was deemed immoral, a charge which was denied by the theater managers. Then, things just got worse for Munson. In October 1921, she and her manager, Ben Judell, were arrested for conspiracy to commit acts injurious to public morals. This happened at a theater in St. Louis, as she was posing partially nude in a public appearance related to the rehashed movie Innocence. Munson had been doing this sort of appearance for years. During the run of her previous films, 5 and 6 years previously, she had made appearances where she would briefly pose nude or almost nude. But these were not generally received as lewd, but again as an artistic expression. Now, suddenly, she was arrested for doing it. At her trial, she was ultimately acquitted after only 5 minutes of jury deliberation. By this point, she was in a very dark place. After living obscurely in poverty, the film that appeared to be her saving grace had flopped despite all the attention. Then she had been very publicly arrested and humiliated, and would soon be seen as too old to be beautiful, if not already. In the lead-up to the release of Heedless Moths, she had appeared in the news by announcing her desire to find a physically perfect husband for her future children, complementary to her claim to being the physically perfect woman. A man was apparently selected, but nothing came of it. In 1922, after receiving a telegram, she went up to her bedroom saying, This will end my misery." While her mother went to get help after this troubling statement, Munson took 4 tablets of poisonous mercury bichloride. The contents of the telegram are not known, but it might have been her supposed fiancé from her public search canceling their engagement. Munson survived, then quickly declared her desire to live, and claimed that the attempt had been a lapse in judgment. She practically disappeared for the next 9 years, living in seclusion with her mother on the outskirts of Syracuse, New York. Even her neighbors didn't see her go outside for years on end. In 1931, she was placed in St. Lawrence Hospital for the Insane in Ogdenburg, New York, by her mother, who said her daughter was experiencing prolonged depression, delusions, and hallucinations. Audrey refused to see any reporters. She felt exploited by artists, movie producers, and journalists, and didn't want to give them any more of herself to profit on. She would stay in that asylum for the next 65 years, dying in 1996 at the age of 104. Her mother had died in 1958 and had been her only visitor. For a quarter of a century, she would have no visitors from the outside. A half-niece found out about her existence, and in 1984, she went to visit Munson, wanting to reunite her father with his long-lost sister. Just imagine it. You figure out that you're related to a woman who is considered one of the most beautiful in the world, featured in sculptures and statues all around your own country. You expect her to be long dead, but you find her pent up in an asylum she had spent more than half of her life in. Her half-niece has gone down on record as saying that she thought Munson's mind was perfectly fine when she found her, and she continued to visit her until her death. Audrey Munson's life was tragic. She had been at the top of the world, but it all came crashing down. She considered her beauty a curse, that she was being punished for some reason. But her legacy lives on in the dozens of statues modeled after her that can still be found in cities in the US, like New York, Washington, D.C., Madison, Oakland, and Jacksonville. Some of you watching may even have seen one of these statues. Maybe you pass by one of them every day, and now you know the story of the person behind it. On December 3rd, 1926, the famous mystery novelist Agatha Christie disappeared. She had left her home in Berkshire, west of London, and never returned. The irony that one of the best creators of mysteries had disappeared mysteriously was not lost among the public. By that point in her life, Christie had become an established author and had almost already reached the status as a master of mystery and crime stories, alongside such famous names as Sherlock Holmes author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. She had 6 published novels, her first in 1921, and her most recent novel, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, had been very well received commercially and critically. The day after she disappeared, her car was found abandoned near a natural spring, where, legend had it, multiple people had died, which led some to believe something paranormal had happened. Although most still thought there was a more natural explanation for it. There was a large nationwide search, with help from the likes of fellow crime writers Dorothy Sayers and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Doyle, being a prominent spiritualist, even sought the help of a medium and tried to have the mystery solved through supernatural means. And the newspapers, both normal and tabloid, constantly ran updates and articles on the search. Countless rumors circulated, some of which were sensational enough to be in one of Christie's own novels. Some believed it was all a publicity stunt to stir interest in her recent releases. This was vehemently denied by her secretary. Others believed she was murdered by her husband, Archie Christie, who was questioned by police. This theory was suspiciously coincidental when it was found that Archie had recently informed Agatha that he wanted a divorce after 14 years of marriage because he had fallen in love with another woman. But there was no evidence indicating that Archie had murdered her. And still others thought she had committed suicide, though this was hard to believe for many considering her career was at a high point and only seemed to be on the road to further success. But if she had disappeared or killed herself deliberately, why would she have done it at such a successful time in her career? And why would she have knowingly left her 7-year-old daughter motherless? The whole incident made people's imaginations run wild. Thousands of police officers and citizen volunteers assisted in the search for Christie. They searched what was called the Silent Pool, near where her car had been found, and other nearby areas, unsure if they were looking for her remains or not. After the discovery of her abandoned car, there had been little evidence to go on, and local police were getting ready to contact Scotland Yard for assistance. A few days after her disappearance, it was reported that Archie's brother had received a letter from Agatha shortly before she had disappeared, where she explained that she had gone to a health resort in Yorkshire. But incredibly, this was pretty much disregarded by police. Christie also left notes to Archie and her secretary, but Archie and his brother apparently burned the letters they had received. And the letter to her secretary was thought to not contain any clues as to her disappearance, although she did mention that she was going to Yorkshire. But then, on December 14th, a week and a half after her disappearance, Christie was suddenly discovered in Harrogate, in none other than North Yorkshire. She had been recognized by an employee while staying at a spa hotel there, and it had been discovered that she had signed in with the assumed name Teresa Neal, using the surname of the woman Archie was leaving her for. So the letters Christie had left to her secretary and brother-in-law would have been very useful clues in hindsight. The mystery had been solved, or so it had seemed. But when Christie was questioned by police, she provided no answers for the cause of her disappearance. It was not that she refused to do so, she claimed, but that she couldn't remember. So it seemed that, in another twist, Christie had suffered a severe case of amnesia. This was especially ironic because amnesia was, and would continue to be, a trope often used in mystery novels. She never changed her story, continuing to claim that, aside from some vague and scattered details, those 11 days were almost completely blank in her memory. She settled back into her normal life, and would, of course, go on to write many famous and popular mystery novels, and this bizarre incident was mostly forgotten as the years went on. But for those who were still curious, even with the missing person found, there were still no definitive answers, and there never would be. Agatha Christie would never directly address her mysterious disappearance, publicly or privately, not even in her own autobiography published posthumously 50 years later. After her death, there could only be speculation. And for the most part, the same theories remain. First was the obvious, that she had been telling the truth and had truly suffered from amnesia or a similar psychological disorder, and had never regained her memory of the event. Her memory loss had apparently been confirmed by doctors in London shortly after she had been found. The theory that her disappearance had been part of a publicity stunt has mostly been dismissed, and hadn't been taken too seriously at the time. And there has also been the theory that Christie had planned to commit suicide over the personal struggles of her failing marriage, but had decided against it and just wanted to get away from everything for a while. And maybe it was just too personal or embarrassing for her to talk about. Victorian Stoicism may also have played a part in her silence. The only conclusion to this bizarre story is that you have to draw your own based on the evidence we have. We'll probably never know for sure what caused Agatha Christie to disappear for those 11 days. And it does make for a better story that way. Besides, life is better with a little mystery, right? One of the most interesting stories of friendship and its eventual demise is that of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Harry Houdini. Their short-lived friendship had its ups and downs, but was eventually permanently destroyed by one thing: the paranormal. Both of these men had achieved fame in their own right. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, a Scotsman, had created one of the most lasting characters in literature, Sherlock Holmes, in the late 1880s, and had also written other famous stories. Houdini, born in Hungary but raised in the US, was, by the beginning of the 1920s, a world-renowned magician and escape artist, whose illusions and stunts baffled and amazed audiences the world over. These two great men eventually met in 1920 and began their friendship, but they differed on one important topic. Around the time he had written the first Sherlock Holmes story, Doyle became interested in spiritualism. At first, he was skeptical, but after visiting a reportedly haunted house, he heard some noises inside, and when he learned that a young child was buried in the garden of the property, he was convinced that ghosts were real and that they could be contacted. He attended various seances and spiritualist gatherings and demonstrations. His belief was perhaps further solidified when he believed that he had been able to contact his son, who had died in World War I, from beyond the grave. Doyle still retained these beliefs into the 1920s, and wrote a lot of books on spiritualism throughout the decade. While Houdini is mostly known for his incredible stunts, such as escaping from handcuffs, escaping from a straitjacket while suspended upside down, and his famous Chinese water torture cell act, he also had another hobby that he was very passionate about: debunking spiritual mediums and psychics. You see, early in his career as an illusionist, Houdini had acted as a medium and a psychic, and he understood all the tricks. He himself had tricked people into believing that they could contact their dead loved ones through him, and he felt immense guilt for doing something he thought was very cruel, so he wanted to make good. Houdini wanted to believe in spiritualism, and was open to the idea, but just didn't see enough proof to convince him that it was real. Doyle and Houdini often tried persuading the other into sharing his beliefs concerning spiritualism, but neither budged very much in their convictions. Houdini sometimes went in disguise to seances and then debunked the medium then and there. Even though Houdini was doing this, Doyle wasn't exactly offended at first. He believed that Houdini was getting rid of the frauds and bad actors within the spiritualist movement, and that that was a good thing. 1922 would prove to be a climactic year in their short-lived friendship. Both had already discussed and disagreed with each other's beliefs, and both had tried to demonstrate to the other that they were mistaken. When Doyle came to America to lecture on spiritualism in 1922, Houdini invited him to attend the annual meeting of the Society of American Magicians. Doyle decided to make a move, to give a reasonable doubt to all these illusionists that maybe they were wrong about spiritualism. Using a film projector, Doyle displayed an incredible scene: dinosaurs, alive and moving in the flesh. The audience was in shock. They knew logically that what they were seeing couldn't be real, but there it was, right in front of their eyes. What this was in reality was a stop-motion test clip made for the production of the 1925 film The Lost World, which was based on Doyle's 1912 novel. By modern standards, this animation looks rather crude, and while stop-motion had certainly been used before, it could still give the illusion of reality to the many who weren't yet familiar with it. Doyle didn't explain the origin of the footage at the meeting, but just let the images sink in. He wanted to prove to them that just because something seemed incredible or even impossible, that didn't necessarily mean it couldn't be real. This wasn't intended to be a really serious argument, and he told Houdini the real story behind it shortly afterward. That same year, Doyle's wife, Jean, who was a self-professed medium, tried to contact Houdini's mother, who he had loved very much and had died 9 years earlier. But even though he desperately wanted to believe that he could talk to his mother again, it didn't work. Through her contact with Houdini's mother, she had produced a long message in perfect English that she claimed Houdini's mother's spirit had written through her. Houdini disregarded this as proof, saying that his mother could barely speak English, no less write it. Doyle publicly wrote that Jean had contacted Houdini's mother, and while Houdini disagreed, he didn't say anything publicly. At least, not directly. Houdini did publicly say afterward that he had never seen proof of any true power in a psychic medium. Although an indirect jab, it hurt Jean's feelings, and Doyle was offended by this comment. In 1924, Houdini famously debunked the medium Mina Crandon. He was on a panel of judges selected by the magazine Scientific American, which had put up a large sum of money for anyone who could convince the panel that they possessed real psychic powers. Houdini was the only judge who was not convinced, then proceeded to demonstrate how she performed the illusion. He made her do it again wearing a special box which prevented her from moving her foot, which Houdini said was what she was using to ring a bell and convince everyone that a spirit was in fact ringing it. She wasn't able to do it again. Crandon's family alleged that Houdini tampered with the procedure just so he wouldn't be proven wrong, and Doyle was a firm believer that Crandon's powers were genuine. Perhaps he too believed that Houdini had sabotaged the demonstration because of his stubbornness to believe, but I couldn't actually find his opinion about it. He was surely still sore about Houdini not recognizing his wife's psychic powers, and by this point, their friendship was effectively over. So that was the story of two great influential men whose relationship deteriorated because of a mutual frustration over the other's belief, or lack thereof, in the paranormal. I would say that this was a strange reason for such a feud, but I guess that's what happens when you have two prideful and stubborn people who are unwavering in their own beliefs. Alright, so this next story is pretty random. It involved a Hollywood studio, a lion, and an airplane. I think we're all familiar with the MGM lion. Even into the modern day, before the start of every MGM movie, a lion appears in a circle and lets out a mighty roar. This is a tradition that can be traced back to the early years of the studio's history. In 1924, Goldwyn Pictures would merge with two other studios, Metro Pictures and Louis B. Mayer Pictures, to form Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. The logo sequence changed a bit before and after this transitional period, so here's a brief timeline. A few years earlier, in 1920, the Goldwyn intro had looked like this, just a still image of a lion. Then there was one with a lion snarling a little and looking straight at the camera. Then there was a different lion looking around slightly confused. The first official MGM lion was named Slats, and he was the one in the last clip I showed. He appeared in the logo until 1928. In September 1927, however, another lion named Jackie was set to take his place. For a publicity campaign, Jackie was to fly across the country, billed as Leo the Lion, the official name for the studio's mascot, and was to be displayed so that East Coast movie lovers could see the real MGM lion in person, though once again, Jackie hadn't actually taken over yet. The reason this was done in a plane was probably because flying had recently become a very popular novelty, with Charles Lindbergh having completed his transatlantic flight only a few months earlier. Jackie was placed in a cage in the middle of the aircraft, surrounded by glass, so he could easily be seen by people after the plane landed. The pilot in charge was Martin Jensen, an experienced stunt pilot who, a month earlier, had competed in an air race from Oakland, California to Honolulu, Hawaii, and took second place. Not far into the flight, however, there were problems. This was because the load was too heavy. Not only was a huge 375-pound adult lion inside, but there were also large amounts of milk and water for him, as well as extra fuel to help offset the heavy weight. But the extra fuel did not solve the problem, and Jensen couldn't get the plane to climb high enough to clear the Mogollon Rim, which is a high escarpment or plateau, and strong air currents also didn't help things. Jensen quickly decided that he had to crash land into some trees to lessen the impact. Fortunately for him, this worked out just as he had planned, and he was able to escape through the broken front window instead of having to go past the probably very aggravated lion. Jackie was okay too, with only some minor scratches, and was probably confused. Before going off to find help, Jensen took off a piece of aluminum from the plane and made a bowl for Jackie, then filled it with water from a nearby creek. He also fed Jackie some sandwiches he had brought with him. Because he had landed in a very isolated desert area in Arizona, help was not easy to find. After 3 days of wandering, he finally found a ranch, and the rancher gave him food and lodging. A full 6 days after the crash, Jensen led a group of rescuers to the crash site, and MGM even provided a lion trainer to help. Jackie had been languishing alone in a cage in the middle of the remote Arizona desert. Just imagine the look on the rancher's face when Jensen told him there was a lion in the desert. The rancher agreed to go take some food to Jackie, and directed Jensen to another ranch that had a telephone. When he got there, he called MGM, who immediately asked, "How's the lion?" But after being found, he was fed some fresh meat, and was apparently in a good mood, all things considered. Jackie, still in his cage, was lifted onto a flat door and transported 7 miles by mule to a ranch, where a truck was waiting to take him back to California. The whole thing had actually been a pretty good piece of publicity. MGM was in the news for this crazy incident, and it was a more positive story rather than a scandal. With the exception of some animal rights groups who questioned the whole idea of putting Jackie on a plane in the first place, the whole expedition was seen more as an exciting, though unintentional, adventure to rescue a lost lion from the American wilderness. Of course, it wasn't as romantic as it sounded, since Jackie wasn't wandering around, but in fact sitting in a cage. But for 6 days in 1927, there had been a lion in the middle of a desert in Arizona, which sounds so completely random out of context. And that was that. Jackie might not have made it to New York that time around, but he didn't seem too perturbed by that. He went on to become the first MGM lion to have the sound of its roar recorded for the logo sequence, and appeared at the beginning of most MGM movies until 1956. And he was, by all accounts, a very good boy. I think most of you have probably heard of Orson Welles' famous 1938 War of the Worlds radio broadcast. The story goes that it caused mass panic because many listeners thought it was a real news report about an alien invasion. This telling is quite a bit exaggerated, but it has stuck in the public consciousness even up to the modern day. But what if I told you that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened? This is the story of how a British radio broadcaster unintentionally caused panic throughout England. That broadcaster was the BBC. Let's go back 12 years before the War of the Worlds broadcast to 1926 in London, where a fairly new British radio station operated by the British Broadcasting Corporation had been in operation for almost 4 years. At this point, it was still a privately owned company rather than the state-affiliated institution it is today. Radio was still pretty new at that time, and music programs dominated the airwaves. One man, an eccentric Catholic priest named Father Ronald Knox, decided to plan an elaborate fake news broadcast for a 17-minute parody, an idea thought unlikely to cause panic because it was clearly framed as fictional. On January 16, 1926, at 7:40 p.m., Father Knox put his script into action under the program title, Broadcasting the Barricades. The broadcast began by interrupting an academic lecture on literature for a news report. Knox, imitating BBC contributors, went on to report a massive riot that was happening in London. Complete with realistic sound effects, he said that the National Gallery had been sacked, and that Big Ben had been set ablaze and came crashing down. The riots turned deadly as one Theophilus Gooch was reportedly being roasted alive in Trafalgar Square, and a Mr. Wotherspoon, the Minister of Traffic, had been hanged from a lamppost. Knox also pretended to receive news updates frequently, as you would expect in a chaotic situation such as this. And to add even more realism, the program occasionally fluttered back and forth with a live broadcast of the Savoy Hotel's house band playing music. Then an explosion sounded, and the signal went permanently back to the news report, with Knox proclaiming that the Savoy Hotel had been blown up by the rioters. For the climax of the broadcast, Knox reported that the rioters were just outside the BBC office, and the program cut to music playing. Listeners believing that the broadcast was real would have thought that London was being destroyed, and their faithful radio announcer was currently being murdered by a riotous crowd. While we don't have the original broadcast, the original script does exist apparently, and with just that, it's not easy to see how this report could have been construed as real news. With names like Mr. Popplebury, who was the secretary of the National Movement for Abolishing Theater Cues, it should have been obvious that it was a satire. But with radio still a medium in its infancy, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of the listeners. Radio reports were sent in real time. That meant that they could distribute news much faster than newspapers. And additionally, news sources like the BBC then were generally trusted. Radio could report things that newspapers wouldn't be able to report until the following day. So if a huge news story like an upheaval were happening, radio was just about the only source that could relay it onto people so quickly other than word of mouth. And things like sound effects were still novelties at that time, and a trusted news source wouldn't possibly use fake sounds, right? So it must have been real. And most importantly, the BBC had a monopoly in broadcasting in the UK at that time. But just like Orson Welles' famous broadcast, probably the main reason some people believed it was real was because they tuned in midway through the program and had missed the beginning where it was framed as entertainment. As for listeners not noticing the obvious elements of comedy, I guess that's just simply due to gullibility or a lack of understanding. They had been caught unaware by this form of satire that was ahead of its time. Also, the historical context of the period also played a part. Workers' riots were a real threat at the time, especially since only about 4 months after this broadcast, a dramatic general strike was conducted in London. And while this relevant issue was an essential part of the joke, it also played on people's actual fears. Father Knox was probably a bit surprised and a little amused to learn that his satirical program had caused some panic outside of London, where people couldn't see with their own eyes that the city was completely fine. Concerned people phoned into the station, one angry man saying that his wife, who had a weak heart, had fainted because of it. Only about an hour after the program had finished, the BBC had to issue a public apology for the incident, saying, Some listeners, who apparently only heard part of Father Knox's talk at 7:40 this evening, did not realize the humorous innuendos underlying the imaginary news items, and have felt uneasy as to the fate of London, Big Ben, and other places mentioned in the talk. The preliminary announcement stated that the talk was a skit on broadcasting, and the whole talk was, of course, a burlesque. We hope that any listeners who did not realize it will accept our sincere apologies for any uneasiness caused. London is safe, Big Ben is still chiming, and all is well. While the program certainly received backlash, one BBC head counted 2,307 positive reviews and only 249 criticisms in the press within a month after the controversial broadcast. So it seemed that only a relatively small number of people were negatively affected by the fake news report. In another humorous anecdote, the New York Times wrote about the incident in an article titled, "We are safe from such jesting," saying, "Large numbers of people were filled with anxiety. Such a thing as that could not happen in this country." Such an overconfident statement is hilarious considering what would happen 12 years later. Orson Welles actually stated that he was influenced by the story of Father Knox's broadcast, at least the general idea, when he was preparing to do his own. So that's the short story of the first major hoax in radio, even though it was unintentional. And for this humorous little event in history, we can thank one clever priest. Perhaps the most important inventions for the music industry in the 1920s were the electric microphone and the electrical recording process. The subsequent jump in audio quality was revolutionary. For record companies, this development was comparable to how the talkie revolution changed the movie industry. On a technical level, it was also very similar to how hi-fi changed everything decades later. Before the invention of the electric microphone, recordings could only be made acoustically. This gave them a tinny sound quality. When being recorded acoustically, the singer or speaker would have to sing or speak into a big brass horn more loudly than they would do naturally. Carbon microphones were invented in the 1870s. Then the condenser microphone was invented in 1916, which was an improvement, but still had a relatively limited frequency pickup. Ribbon microphones were then introduced in the early 1920s, and made some more improvements. The first recording using an electrical process was a recording of the funeral services for the unknown soldier at Westminster Abbey in 1920 with a condenser microphone, though the recording quality wasn't as good as it had been hoped. The electric microphone's frequency range greatly improved on acoustic microphones, from a 250 to 2,500 Hz range to a 60 to 6,000 Hz range. I don't know anything about those measurements, but they certainly seem like an improvement. When recording music in the acoustic era, some instruments had to be switched so the sound would be picked up or wouldn't drown out the other instruments. In early jazz records, drummers traded their drum sets for something that made less sound, such as wooden blocks. You can hear this in records from the original Dixieland Jazz Band, for example. Bass instruments were sometimes difficult to use for acoustic recordings. String basses were often swapped for something with more sound output, such as a tuba. So you may be asking yourself, what does the difference in sound quality actually sound like? First, take this example of an acoustic jazz recording from the early 1920s. Now, compare that with an electric jazz recording from the second half of the decade. For a more direct comparison, here's George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, first an acoustic recording, then an electric one, which were separated by only a few years. The new electric process, developed by Western Electric, was called the Westrex process. After taking some time to think, the top two record companies, Victor and Columbia, decided to license the Westrex process in 1925. The cost of the system was high, but both companies took the risk, hoping that the improved quality of records would stimulate sales. Though, when they adopted this new system and made new records with it, they didn't make it public knowledge right away. This was because they wanted to sell off their acoustic records first, so they wouldn't lose the money from their already made products after they so suddenly became outdated. In November 1925, Victor was the first to advertise the new process. The company spent more than $1 million on this particular advertising campaign. But it was a success, more than making up for the cost of the new process and the advertising. While some record companies continued to record acoustically for a while, by the end of the 1920s, all had switched to the new electrical process. But the failure of some to do so sooner led to a financial hit. Edison Records, for example, was the last major record company to make the switch, doing so 2 years later in 1927, which contributed to its complete collapse by 1929. Similar to what happened to actors after talkies became mainstream, many singers from the acoustic era of recording became irrelevant in the new electric age. They had to sing extra loudly when recording, practically shouting, and with the new popularity of soft-singing crooners, their style of singing quickly fell out of favor. So, the electric microphone and the electric recording process revolutionized the music and recording industry permanently, and it set a new standard for audio quality. Now, people could listen to classical music and actually be able to hear the soft, precise sounds that made them special. And now that individual instruments could be distinguished better when a jazz band was all playing together, musicians like Duke Ellington took advantage of this development by experimenting with instrumentation. Without the electric recording process, East St. Louis Toodaloo would not have worked as well as it did. While not remembered nearly as much as the talkie revolution, it was a very important step toward future developments like hi-fi, and it absolutely deserves to be talked about more. I hope you enjoyed these better versions of my old videos. I really wanted to reclaim these ideas since I thought they were interesting topics. The originals had terrible audio quality, terrible narration, and some of them couldn't be monetized due to copyright reasons, but I didn't want the ideas to go to waste. I'm hoping to do another one of these at some point, but not anytime soon because I have a bunch of other new video ideas I want to do first. And I think I need to make a few more shorter videos to add to the compilation before I put it all together. But anyway, let me know what you thought about this video in the comments. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.